Hello and welcome to Cheating Tales Lab. We're glad to have you with us, and we hope you enjoy today's story. It's going to be a wild ride, so let's not waste any time and begin. Blake Thompson's red pen hovered over the last paper in the stack. The clock on his classroom wall read 9:45 p.m. Another Friday evening sacrificed to grading. He sighed, realizing he'd become more dedicated to his students' chemistry equations than to his own life. At precisely 9:47 p.m., his phone rang. The shrill tone cut through the silence, startling him. Blake frowned at the unfamiliar number. "Yes," he answered, impatience coloring his tone. "Blake, get home now." Mrs. Caldwell's voice crackled through the speaker, trembling with urgency. "There's some man in your house with Natalie. It's embarrassing. The whole neighborhood can hear it." Blake's mind raced through possibilities. A burglar? A misunderstanding? Or, he swallowed hard, refusing to entertain the unthinkable. His hands shook as he grabbed his car keys, knocking over the neat stack of graded papers. Red ink splattered across the pristine white tile floor, a stark contrast to the ordered world he thought he knew. As he sped home, Blake fumbled with his phone, dialing 911. His voice sounded foreign to his own ears as he reported a possible break-in at his address. The dispatcher's calm tone grated on his frayed nerves. Blake ran multiple red lights, his heart pounding a staccato rhythm against his ribs. He tried to prepare himself for what he might find, but how does one prepare for the destruction of their world? The tires of his sensible sedan screeched as he pulled into the driveway at 10:03 p.m. The house loomed before him, no longer the sanctuary he'd left that morning. The front door stood slightly ajar, a silent sentinel to the chaos within. A single high-heeled shoe lay in the entryway, scarlet and accusing. Blake's throat constricted as he recognized it as Natalie's favorite pair, the one she'd worn on their anniversary dinner last month. "Natalie," he called out, his voice echoing through the eerie silence. No response came, save for the pounding of his own heart in his ears. As Blake moved through the house, evidence of upheaval assaulted his senses. Open drawers gaped like wounds, clothes strewn about in careless disarray, empty spaces on shelves and walls marked where cherished possessions once sat, now conspicuous in their absence. In the kitchen, a glint caught his eye. Natalie's wedding ring lay discarded on the counter, a cold circle of metal next to an empty bottle of champagne. The label mocked him. It was the expensive brand they'd been saving for their next anniversary. With leaden feet, Blake approached the bedroom. Their sanctuary, their private world, now felt like a crime scene. He froze at the threshold, unable to cross into the new reality that awaited him. The bedroom was a war zone. Drawers hung open, their contents ejected onto the floor. The closet door swung lazily on its hinges, hangers dangling empty where Natalie's clothes should have been. The mattress lay askew, as if someone had searched beneath it in haste. On the rumpled sheets, a piece of paper caught his eye. Blake's hands trembled as he picked up the hastily scrawled note. He recognized Natalie's handwriting immediately, each loop and curve a dagger to his heart. "I'm running away with my lover. Never try to find us, or you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Don't bother with the police. They won't help you." The words blurred as tears welled in Blake's eyes. He collapsed onto the bed, the magnitude of the betrayal crushing him like a physical weight. With numb fingers, he pulled out his phone and checked their joint account. The balance stared back at him. A stark zero where their life savings, $247,632, should have been. The safe in the closet hung open, a gaping maw. Blake stumbled towards it, already knowing what he would find. Empty. The jewelry passed down through generations of his family gone, vanished, just like his wife. As the reality of his situation sank in, Blake's shock gave way to anger. A cold determination settled over him, hardening his features. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was theft. It was destruction. And he would have justice. Mrs. Caldwell peered through her living room curtains, watching as a police cruiser pulled up to Blake's house. She clutched her robe tighter, guilt gnawing at her insides. Perhaps she should have called earlier, when she first heard the strange noises. But it wasn't her place to pry, was it? She'd always thought Blake and Natalie were such a nice couple. Quiet, respectful. The kind of neighbors you wanted on your street. But the sounds she'd heard earlier, they weren't the sounds of a happy marriage. As she watched Blake emerge from the house, his face ashen in the harsh porch light, Mrs. Caldwell felt a pang of sympathy. Whatever had happened in that house tonight, she knew nothing would ever be the same for the young chemistry teacher. The police officer approached Blake, notepad in hand. Mrs. Caldwell couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see the defeat in Blake's posture, the way his shoulders slumped as he spoke. She turned away from the window, unable to watch anymore. The neighborhood would be buzzing with gossip tomorrow. But for now, all she felt was a profound sadness for the man whose life had just been torn apart. Inside the house, Blake sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the form in front of him. How do you quantify a life in checkboxes and dollar amounts? The officer's voice seemed to come from far away. Mr. Thompson, I know this is difficult, but I need you to be as detailed as possible. Every item that's missing, no matter how small, could be important. Blake nodded mechanically, forcing himself to focus. The ring, he said, his voice hoarse. My grandmother's ring. It was worth. I don't know. How do you put a price on something like that? As he continued listing items, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that this was all a nightmare. Any moment now, he'd wake up, and Natalie would be there, smiling at him over her morning coffee. But the harsh reality refused to fade. This was his life now. A life of betrayal, loss, and an emptiness he couldn't begin to fathom. As the officer left, promising to do what he could, Blake remained at the table, staring at the note Natalie had left. The words seemed to mock him, each one a testament to his failure as a husband. He crumpled the paper in his fist, a low growl escaping his throat. This wouldn't be the end. He wouldn't let it be. Whatever it took, however long it took, he would find Natalie and her lover. He would reclaim what was rightfully his. The Boy Scout was gone. In his place stood a man with nothing left to lose. And that made him dangerous. Saturday morning dawned with a cruel brightness that mocked Blake Thompson's shattered world. He sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the two police officers across from him. Their skepticism was palpable, hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. Detective Nina Rodriguez, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, tapped her pen against her notepad. Mr. Thompson, I understand you're upset, but given the note your wife left, this seems more like a domestic dispute than a crime. Blake's hands clenched into fists under the table. She stole everything, he ground out. Our life savings, family heirlooms. How is that not a crime? Rodriguez sighed, exchanging a glance with her partner. Marital assets are complicated, Mr. Thompson. Without evidence of coercion or fraud, it's difficult to pursue this as a criminal matter. As the detectives left, their platitudes about doing what they could ringing hollow in Blake's ears, he knew he needed another option. He couldn't just sit and wait while Natalie and her lover enjoyed their ill-gotten gains. A memory surfaced, a colleague mentioning a private investigator who specialized in difficult cases. What was the name? Reeves. Jonathan Reeves. With trembling fingers, Blake dialed a number. Each ring felt like an eternity until a gruff voice answered. Reeves Investigations. Mr. Reeves? My name is Blake Thompson. I need your help. My wife. She's stolen everything and run off with another man. The police won't do anything. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a heavy sigh. Come to my office. We'll talk. An hour later, Blake found himself in a cluttered office that smelled of stale coffee and cigarettes. Jonathan Reeves, a man with the build of an ex-soldier and the eyes of someone who'd seen too much, leaned back in his chair, studying Blake with an intensity that made him squirm. So, Reeves said, his voice as rough as gravel, your wife cleaned you out and ran off with her lover. Classic. But there's something more here, isn't there? Something that's got you spooked beyond the usual betrayal. Blake nodded, swallowing hard. The note she left, it was threatening, and the way everything was taken, it was too organized. This wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision. Reeves' eyes narrowed. You think there's more to her lover than just being the other man? I don't know, Blake admitted, but something feels off. Can you help me? Reeves stood, pacing behind his desk. His mind was already churning, the complexities of the case intriguing him more than he cared to admit. I'll take the case, Mr. Thompson, but I warn you, you might not like what we find. Blake's jaw set in a hard line. I need to know the truth, Mr. Reeves, whatever it is. As Blake left the office, Reeves watched him go, a frown creasing his weathered features. This case was more than just another jealous husband seeking revenge. There was a depth here, a complexity that tugged at his instincts. He'd seen cases like this before, during his time in the military. They rarely ended well. Reeves picked up his phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. Hey, it's Reeves. I need a favor. Run a background check on a Natalie Thompson and any men she might be associated with. Yeah, it's urgent. As he hung up, Reeves couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped into something far bigger than a simple marital dispute. But that's what made it interesting. And Jonathan Reeves lived for interesting. The next week passed in a blur of sleepless nights and caffeine-fueled days for Blake. He went through the motions at work, teaching his chemistry classes with a detachment that worried his more perceptive students. But behind his glazed eyes, his mind was constantly churning, replaying every moment of his life with Natalie, searching for clues he might have missed. Jonathan Reeves, meanwhile, was in his element. The ex-military man turned private investigator had called in every favor, pulled every string, and greased every palm necessary to unravel the mystery of Natalie Thompson and her lover. On a dreary Tuesday afternoon, Reeves called Blake to his office. The chemistry teacher arrived to find the PI's desk covered in papers, photographs, and what looked like financial records. Sit down, Mr. Thompson, Reeves said, his voice grim. We've got a lot to cover. Blake sank into the chair, his heart pounding. What did you find? Reeves picked up a photo, sliding it across the desk. It showed Natalie, her arm around a handsome man with a dazzling smile. Meet Carl Reese, 28, personal trainer at your wife's gym. And as it turns out, a professional con man with a taste for wealthy, bored housewives. Blake's fingers trembled as he picked up the photo. How long? Based on gym records and credit card statements, they've been in contact for about 6 months, Reeves said, his tone matter-of-fact. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Over the next hour, Reeves laid out a pattern of deception that left Blake reeling. Carl Reese, it turned out, wasn't even his real name. The man had multiple aliases, a history of similar scams across 3 states, and connections to a small-time criminal organization specializing in identity theft. He's good, Reeves admitted, a grudging respect in his voice. Changes his name, his look, his backstory. But he always targets the same type, women with access to significant funds and a yearning for excitement. Blake's mind was spinning. But Natalie, she's smart. How could she fall for this? Reeves leaned back in his chair, his eyes hard. Love makes fools of us all, Mr. Thompson. Or what we think is love. Anyway, your wife probably thought she was special, the one who'd finally tamed the bad boy. It's a common fantasy. As Blake struggled to process this information, Reeves dropped another bombshell. We've traced a storage unit rented under one of Reese's aliases. It might contain evidence, maybe even some of your stolen property. Hope flared in Blake's chest for the first time in days. Can we go there? Now. Reeves nodded, already reaching for his coat. No time like the present. The storage facility was a nondescript building on the outskirts of town. Blake's heart raced as they approached Unit 237, the one Reeves had identified as belonging to Carl Reese. But as they turned the corner, they saw a car peeling out of the parking lot, tires squealing. Through the back window, Blake caught a glimpse of familiar brown hair. "Natalie," he breathed, his voice a mixture of pain and anger. Reeves cursed, breaking into a run. But by the time they reached the unit, it was too late. The door hung open. The interior picked clean save for a few empty boxes. "Damn it," Reeves growled. "We missed them by minutes." As they stood there, the acrid taste of defeat in their mouths, a security guard approached. "Hey, you can't be here without." Reeves flashed a badge, cutting him off. "Private investigator. We need to see your security footage. Now." 20 minutes later, they watched grainy footage of Carl and Natalie loading suitcases into their car. They moved with purpose, like people preparing for a long trip. "They knew we were closing in," Reeves muttered. "They're running." Blake stared at the frozen image of Natalie on the screen, the woman he'd loved, the woman he thought he knew, loading up stolen goods with the ease of a practiced criminal. It made him sick. "What now?" he asked, his voice hollow. Reeves' eyes narrowed. "Now, we follow the money." Over the next few days, Reeves worked his contacts tirelessly. Blake alternated between pacing nervously in the PI's office and going through the motions at school, his mind 1,000 miles away. Finally, on Friday afternoon, Reeves burst into his office where Blake sat, head in his hands. "We've got them," he announced, triumph in his voice. "My source at the airport just called. Carl purchased last-minute tickets to Belize. They're flying out tonight." Blake stood so quickly he knocked over his chair. "Belize? We have to stop them." Reeves was already grabbing his coat. "That's the plan, Mr. Thompson. Let's go catch ourselves some thieves." As they raced to the airport, Blake's mind whirled with possibilities. What would he say when he saw Natalie? What would she say? And Carl? Blake's hands clenched into fists at the thought of the man who had stolen his wife and his life savings. Little did Blake know, the confrontation awaiting him at the airport would change the course of his life forever. The airport buzzed with the usual chaos of a Friday evening. Families embarking on weekend getaways. Business travelers rushing to make connections. Tearful goodbyes and joyous reunions. But for Blake Thompson and Jonathan Reeves, the crowded terminal was a battleground, and their quarry was in sight. There, at the check-in counter, stood Natalie. Blake's breath caught in his throat. She looked different. Her hair was shorter, dyed a shade darker than he remembered. She wore clothes he'd never seen before, expensive-looking, far from her usual style. And beside her, arm draped possessively around her waist, stood Carl Reese. Blake's vision went red. He surged forward, barely aware of Reeves' warning hand on his arm. "Natalie," he called out, his voice carrying across the terminal. Natalie's head snapped up, her eyes widening in shock as she saw Blake approaching. For a moment, just a moment, Blake thought he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Regret? Fear? But then Carl stepped forward, his charm morphing into menace as he positioned himself between Blake and Natalie. "Well, well," Carl drawled, his voice smooth as oil. "If it isn't the cuckolded husband, come to see us off, Teach." Blake ignored him, his eyes locked on Natalie. "How could you?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Everything we had, everything we built together. How could you throw it all away?" Natalie's face hardened, a mask sliding into place. "You don't understand, Blake. You never did. Carl, he sees me, really sees me. You were always so caught up in your little world of test tubes and homework. You've stolen everything from me," Blake said, his voice carrying across the terminal. People were starting to stare, a circle forming around the confrontation. Carl smirked, his arm tightening around Natalie. "Face it, Teach. She chose me. The money's gone. You've got nothing left." Something snapped inside Blake. He lunged forward, hands reaching for Carl's smug face. But before he could make contact, he felt himself being yanked backward. Airport security had arrived, drawn by the commotion. "Sir, you need to calm down," a burly security guard said, his grip firm on Blake's arm. In the confusion, Carl saw his opportunity. He shoved Blake hard, sending him crashing into a nearby luggage cart. Pain exploded in Blake's side as he hit the ground, the wind knocked out of him. Through watering eyes, he saw Natalie hesitate. For a split second, her hand reached out towards him, concern flashing across her face. But then Carl grabbed her arm, pulling her away. "Natalie, please," Blake gasped, struggling to his feet. But it was too late. The couple had already disappeared into the crowd, swallowed up by the sea of travelers. Security surrounded Blake, peppering him with questions. He barely heard them, his eyes fixed on the spot where Natalie had vanished. She was gone. Really, truly gone. Reeves appeared at his side, flashing his PI badge to the security guards. "My client won't be pressing charges," he said smoothly. "Just a misunderstanding. We'll be on our way now." As Reeves led him out of the airport, Blake felt numb. They had been so close. So damn close. And now what? "It's not over," Reeves said gruffly as they reached the car. "We know where they're going. Belize isn't that big. We'll find them." But Blake barely heard him. All he could see was Natalie's face in that final moment. The hesitation, the almost reach towards him. What did it mean? Was there still something there, some part of the woman he loved? Or was it just another act in her grand deception? As they drove away from the airport, Blake stared out the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. The man looking back at him was a stranger, hollow-eyed, defeated. But underneath the despair, a spark of something else was growing. Determination, rage, a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Natalie and Carl had taken everything from him, his love, his trust, his future. But they'd left him with one thing, nothing left to lose. And that made Blake Thompson a very dangerous man indeed. 3 days after the airport fiasco, Blake Thompson stood before what remained of his home, a bandage wrapped tightly around his bruised ribs. The acrid smell of smoke still hung in the air, mingling with the scent of wet ash from the firefighters' efforts. Yellow police tape fluttered in the breeze, a garish reminder that his sanctuary was now a crime scene. He stared at the charred skeleton of the house, trying to reconcile the blackened timbers with the memories of the life he'd built there. The porch where he and Natalie had shared their first kiss as homeowners. The kitchen where they'd burned countless dinners, laughing as they ordered takeout instead. The bedroom where Blake's jaw clenched, pushing away thoughts of intimacy now tainted by betrayal. A car engine purred behind him, the sound sleek and expensive. Blake turned, expecting to see Jonathan Reeves with an update on their fruitless chase. Instead, a glossy black Mercedes pulled up, its tinted windows reflecting the ruins of his former life. The driver's door opened, and a woman emerged. She moved with the fluid grace of a predator, her sharp suit a stark contrast to the devastation around them. Her eyes, cool and calculating, swept over Blake before settling on his face with unsettling intensity. Blake Thompson, her voice was smooth, cultured, with an edge that hinted at danger. Blake nodded, wary. "Who's asking?" A smile flickered across her lips. There and gone in an instant. "Elisa Vega. We need to talk." She gestured to the passenger seat of her car. Blake hesitated, every instinct screaming that this woman was trouble. But what did he have left to lose? As they drove, Elisa laid out a story that made Blake's head spin. Carl Reese, it turned out, was more than just a small-time con man. He'd been involved with a powerful criminal organization years ago, Elisa's organization, and he'd double-crossed them, disappearing with millions and leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. "We've been hunting him ever since," Elisa said, her voice tight with controlled rage. "And now, thanks to your little airport drama, we know where he is." Blake's mind raced. "So, why come to me? Why not just go after him yourselves?" Elisa's laugh was sharp, humorless. "Carl's smart. He's got leverage. Information that could bring down half the cartels in South America. We need to be delicate." She pulled the car over, turning to face Blake fully. "That's where you come in, Mr. Thompson. Your chemistry skills, combined with our resources, we could create something untraceable, something that would solve all our problems. Blake recoiled. You want me to help you finish them? I want you to help us get justice, Elisa corrected smoothly. For both of us. Don't tell me you haven't thought about it. Alone in that hospital bed, the satisfaction of watching them pay for what they've done. Blake's silence was damning. He had thought about it in his darkest moments. He'd imagined 1,000 ways to make Natalie and Carl suffer. Elisa leaned closer, her voice low and persuasive. I can help you get justice, Blake. But once you're in, there's no going back. Are you sure? The responsible teacher in Blake screamed at him to say no, to walk away and try to rebuild his life. But that man had died the moment he'd read Natalie's betrayal in her own handwriting. In his place was someone new, someone with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. After a moment of internal struggle, Blake nodded, sealing his fate. Elisa's smile was triumphant. Welcome aboard, Mr. Thompson. Let's go catch ourselves some thieves. As they drove away from the ruins of his old life, Blake felt a weight settle on his shoulders. He'd just made a deal with the devil, but if it meant bringing down the people who destroyed everything he loved, he'd gladly burn in hell. Over the next month, Blake Thompson lived 2 lives, each as surreal as the other. By day, he stood before his high school chemistry class, explaining the intricacies of molecular bonds and chemical reactions. His students, blissfully unaware of their teacher's inner turmoil, saw only the same dedicated educator they'd always known. If Mr. Thompson seemed a bit more distracted lately, a bit more intense in his lectures on the volatile nature of certain compounds, well, they chalked it up to the stress of the upcoming midterms. But as the final bell rang each afternoon, Blake shed the skin of the mild-mannered teacher like a snake molting. He drove to a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of town, nodding to the stone-faced guards who knew him now by sight. Inside, a state-of-the-art laboratory awaited him, gleaming with equipment that would make any university green with envy. Here, in this secret lab, Blake worked tirelessly into the night. His hands, once used only for grading papers and conducting harmless experiments, now helping criminals for his own justice. Each night, as he washed the chemical residue from his hands, Blake told himself it was all for justice, that the ends justified the means. But in the dark hours before dawn, alone in the sparse apartment Elisa had provided, he wondered if he'd recognize the man in the mirror when this was all over. Elisa Vega watched Blake's transformation with a mixture of admiration and wariness. She'd seen men consumed by revenge before, had used that hunger to her advantage countless times. But there was something different about Blake Thompson, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere vengeance. It made him unpredictable, and in Elisa's world, unpredictable was dangerous. Still, she couldn't deny the results. Blake's creations were revolutionary, opening up possibilities that made even her jaded associates sit up and take notice. And his insight into Natalie's psyche proved invaluable as they crafted their trap. It was Blake who suggested using Natalie's love of art as bait. She always talked about opening a gallery, he'd said, his voice distant with memory. Said it was her dream to discover the next big artist. Elisa's hackers went to work, creating a flawless digital trail of a new, exclusive art collective in Miami. They fabricated reviews, social media buzz, even a waiting list for potential investors, all designed to catch the eye of a certain fugitive couple looking for their next big score. As they pored over satellite images of the small Belizean town where Carl and Natalie had been tracked, Blake felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. The couple thought they were living in paradise, spending his hard-earned money on beachfront property and expensive cocktails. They had no idea that their world was about to come crashing down. They were planning to sell stolen identities to a rival cartel. Elisa informed him one evening, her voice tight with controlled anger. Seems Carl's ambitions have grown since his days with us. Blake nodded, unsurprised. The man who'd stolen his wife and his life savings wouldn't be content with a simple life on the beach. No, Carl Reese was always looking for the next big score, and that would be his downfall. As Elisa's hackers planted the final pieces of information where Carl was sure to find it, Blake felt a surge of anticipation. The bait was set. Now all they had to do was wait for the fish to bite. In a beachfront villa thousands of miles away, Carl Reese scrolled through his encrypted laptop, his brow furrowed in concentration. Natalie lounged nearby, sipping a margarita and pretending to read a novel. In truth, she was watching Carl, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted back and forth across the screen. "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Carl's face split into a grin, the same charming smile that had first drawn her in all those months ago. "Pack your bags, baby. We're going to Miami." As Natalie rushed to comply, her heart racing with excitement, she pushed away the small voice in the back of her mind, the one that sounded suspiciously like Blake, warning her that if something seemed too good to be true, it probably was. Back in the warehouse lab, Blake put the finishing touches on his latest creation, a clear, odorless liquid that could be mistaken for water, harmless on its own, but when combined with the right catalyst. He held the vial up to the light, watching it shimmer. "Soon," he whispered, and in that moment, it wasn't clear if he was speaking to the poison or to himself. The Miami International Airport buzzed with its usual chaotic energy. Tourists in gaudy shirts mingled with businessmen in crisp suits, all hurrying to their destinations. Among them, two figures moved with purposeful nonchalance, their designer sunglasses and carefully casual attire marking them as people of means. Carl Reese and Natalie Thompson, traveling under the aliases of James and Emily Carter, made their way through the terminal. They were tanned and relaxed, looking for all the world like a wealthy couple returning from an extended vacation. But beneath Carl's easy smile and Natalie's laugh, tension thrummed. This was their biggest score yet, the one that would set them up for life. Neither of them noticed the extra security personnel scattered throughout the airport, or the way certain cameras seemed to track their movements with unusual precision. As they approached the customs desk, Carl's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Natalie's arm. This was the moment of truth. If their false identities didn't hold up, "Welcome back to the States, Mr. and Mrs. Carter," the customs agent said with a bland smile, stamping their passports. "Enjoy your stay." Carl let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They were in. Now the real work could begin. Across town, in a nondescript van filled with surveillance equipment, Blake Thompson watched the airport security feeds with hawkish intensity. His hands clenched into fists as he saw Natalie and Carl pass, through customs unhindered. "They're through," he said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Elisa Vega nodded, her eyes never leaving her own monitor. "Good. Everything's in place on our end. You remember the plan?" Blake nodded. Over the past weeks, he'd used his newfound criminal connections to lay a trail of breadcrumbs. Whispers in the right ears about a major illegal substance theft, rumors in the underworld about Carl and Natalie's betrayal of multiple organizations. And finally, anonymous tips to both the police and rival gangs about the couple's return. It was a house of cards, each piece dependent on the others. If even one element failed, the whole plan could come crashing down. But if it worked, Blake allowed himself a grim smile. If it worked, Carl and Natalie wouldn't know what hit them. As Carl and Natalie's taxi pulled away from the airport, a dozen other vehicles smoothly entered traffic behind them. Police cruisers, unmarked cars filled with stone-faced men, even a few motorcycles weaving through the lanes, all converging on a single point. In their hotel room, Carl and Natalie were riding high on adrenaline and champagne. They'd made it back into the country without a hitch, and tomorrow they'd meet with the art collective that promised to double their already considerable fortune. "To us," Carl said, raising his glass in a toast. "The greatest team since Bonnie and Clyde." Natalie clinked her glass against his, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Lately, she'd found herself thinking of Blake more and more. The look on his face at the airport haunted her dreams. But it was too late for regrets now. She'd made her choice. A sharp knock at the door cut through their celebration. Carl frowned, setting down his glass. Who the hell? He never finished the sentence. The door burst open, a flood of armed men pouring into the room. Shouts of police and DA filled the air, along with the unmistakable sound of weapons being cocked. Carl and Natalie found themselves face down on the plush carpet, hands cuffed behind their backs, as the room was torn apart around them. Bags of white powder were produced from hiding spots they hadn't even known existed. Stacks of cash, weapons, fake passports, all planted earlier by Blake's new associates. As they were led out of the hotel in handcuffs, a crowd had already gathered. News vans jockeyed for position, reporters shouting questions about the international illegal substance ring that had just been busted. From his vantage point in a nearby building, Blake watched the scene unfold with grim satisfaction. Beside him, Elisa Vega allowed herself a small smile. "Well done, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice cool and professional. "I'd say our business is concluded." She held out a small USB drive. "Your wife's share of the money, untraceable as promised." Blake hesitated, staring at the innocuous piece of plastic. And it was enough money to start a new life, to forget this whole sordid affair. But as he reached for it, he found he couldn't quite bring himself to take it. "Donate it," he said abruptly, "anonymously, to my school's chemistry department. They've been needing new equipment for years." Elisa raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. She merely nodded, slipping the drive back into her pocket. "It's been a pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Thompson. I trust you'll remember the importance of discretion in these matters." The threat was clear but unnecessary. Blake had no intention of ever speaking about what had transpired over the past month. He merely nodded, turning back to watch as Carl and Natalie were loaded into separate police vans. As the vans pulled away, sirens wailing, Blake felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It was over. Finally, truly over. Weeks later, Blake stood before his chemistry class, chalk in hand as he explained a particularly complex formula. His students bent over their notebooks, faces screwed up in concentration as they tried to follow along. To an outside observer, nothing would have seemed amiss. Mr. Thompson was the same dedicated teacher he'd always been, perhaps even more passionate about his subject than before. Only Blake knew the truth, that he was changed irrevocably by what he'd been through. As he turned back to the board, a small smile played across his lips. It was the smile of a man who knew he was capable of anything, for better or for worse. The smile of a man who had stared into the abyss and come back stronger. Blake Thompson, high school chemistry teacher, wrote out the final part of the equation with a flourish. His old life was gone, burned away like so much ash. But from those ashes, a new Blake had risen, one who would never again be anyone's victim. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. As the students filed out, chattering about weekend plans and upcoming tests, Blake began to erase the board. With each swipe of the eraser, he felt like he was wiping away another piece of his past. When the board was clean, Blake stepped back, surveying the blank slate before him. It was, he realized, not unlike his life now, a clean slate, ready to be filled with whatever he chose to write upon it. With a final nod to himself, Blake gathered his things and left the classroom. The future, uncertain as it was, awaited. And for the first time in months, he found himself looking forward to it. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.